Hi, I'm Elizabeth Cornwell.
And I'm Rob Penzak.
Welcome to The Road to Reason. Today we're going to be talking about the war on women, or that's how it's been dubbed. Some have termed it the Republican war on women. However, neither term actually really underpins the current rabid attacks against women. These attacks are part of the larger attack on human rights and have been heavily funded by radical, empowered religious extremists based on the views of the Christian Reconstructionism and of the Dominion theology. Thus, the assault against women could be more accurately described as a front, alongside the fronts against public education, science and medicine, progressive social reform, and the separation of church and state. The goal of this war is for complete obedience to religious dogma and the rejection of the ideals of our founding fathers. While the dismantling of women's rights is one prong of this war against the Enlightenment values and principles, it is perhaps the most deeply rooted in religious primitivism. Sex is a long-evolved behavior that affects both mind and body, and in humans it is richly complex. It can be beautiful and life-affirming, yet it can also be destructive and dark. Sex has always been a threat to organized religion because the power of sex eclipses both the mind and the physical, the power that is supposed to be granted to God. Holding control over such strong emotions is essential for any religion to gain complete dominance over the social order. Women are seen as the vessel through which all sexuality emerges, as it was men who were writing of their struggles to overthrow their most basic impulses and desires. Women became the enemy to God and obedience to Him. Christianity does not stand alone in this view of women. Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, and Islam have all had long-standing traditions of denigrating women. Within Christianity, St. Paul and St. Augustine set the tone of the views toward women and their role and purpose in society. They warned early followers of the dangers of sex and of allowing sex to be enjoyed for its pleasure. Their views of women sexually forever shaped the Christian faith. But to control sexual desire, as these and other men of the church saw it, it could only be accomplished by establishing full authority over women. They had to denigrate women as the destroyers of men, a society, a tradition that came easily out of the Judaic teachings, with the morning prayer, "Blessed are you, Lord, our God, ruler of the universe, who has not created me, a woman." The halacha, the laws governing behavior for observant Jews, and today ultra-Orthodox Jews, are similar in many ways to the extreme Islamic laws governing the oppression of women. The influence of these laws have had a long-lasting effect, even after thousands of years. Early Christian teachings strengthened the distrust of women and of sex. In Ephesians 22-23, it is often quoted to define the relationship of woman to man. "Wives, submit to your own husband as to the Lord, for the husband is head of the wife, as also Christ is the head of the church." Tertullian, who was from Carthage and wrote in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, he wrote, "Do you not realize that Eve is you? The curse God pronounced on your sex weighs still on the world. Guilty, you must bear its hardships. You are the devil's gateway. You desecrate the fatal tree. You first betrayed the law of God. You who softened up with your cajoling words the man against whom the devil could not prevail by force. The image of God, the man Adam, you broke him. It was child's play to you. You deserved death, and it was the Son of God who had to die." Whoa, talk about a guilt trip. But there were women and men who did push against such teachings, and this became especially evident in the U.S. during abolitionists and the suffragettes of the time of the 19th century. In a pastoral letter in Massachusetts that was addressing the issue of Sarah and Angelina Gimke, who were anti-slavery activists in New England, they wrote, "We invite your attention to the dangers which at present seem to threaten the female character with widespread and permanent injury. The appropriate duties and influence of women are clearly stated in the New Testament." He goes on to say, "The power of women is in her dependence flowing from the consciousness of that weakness which God has given her for her protection. But when she assumes the place and tone of man as her public reformer, her character becomes unnatural and fall in shame and dishonor into dust. These are the views against women from the religious theocracy. We cannot, therefore, but regret the mistaken conduct of those who encourage females to bear an obtrusive and ostentatious part of the measures of reform and countenance any of that sex who so forget themselves as to itinerate in the character of public lecturers and teachers. These attitudes, as foul and as archaic as they seem, have not vanished. Today's Reconstructionists and Dominionists are doing all they can to take us back to the darker part of our past history. In a book by John Eldredge, so wonderfully called Wild at Heart, Discovering the Secret of a Man's Soul, he writes, "The devastating curse of women ruling over men. Although Reconstructionism and Dominionism may seem so far out as to be easily dismissed, the philosophy they espouse has in fact provided the intellectual basis for much of the religious right's thinking and political activism. It has been a driving force behind groups such as the Christian Coalition, whose leaders talk openly of the need for far-right Christians to take control of the government in everything from local school boards all the way to the White House. And so far, they've done a pretty good job. So we want to focus on how they have actively and successfully worked to eradicate women's autonomy and the control of their own biology. While the public often refers to this as a Republican war against women, I think that is misleading. It is true that the Republican Party opened their tent to the Trojan horse that offered votes from the South and conservative Christians, but they never intended for them to take over the platform of the party. I submit that the leadership of the then Republican Party never imagined the onslaught of the Tea Party that we see today, and the backward religious thinking. Indeed, the Republican Party has been the progressive party of Lincoln and Roosevelt. The change to the Republican Party is not so long ago. President Richard Nixon made his views of the importance of giving women the freedom and the support to control their own bodies clear when he wrote, "It is clear that the domestic family planning services supported by the federal government should be expanded and better integrated. It is my view that no American woman should be denied access to planning assistance because of her economic condition." In 1969, then Representative George H.W. Bush proclaimed, "We need to make family planning a household word." This was the voice of the Republican Party before the invasion of the mind snatchers, the religious extremists. It is important to label this war against women, against individual rights, against public education, science, medicine, and social progress for what it is, religious extremism. To call it anything else misleads both sides of the political aisle, and it prevents us from working together as allies. We must not forget our history, especially in the light of those who would rewrite it. Biblical literarists felt the sting of dissent when both the abolition and suffrage movements expressed their criticism of the deeply rooted biblical traditions of slavery and patriarchy. Social progressives attacked the worldview of religious conservatism and biblical literalism because the Bible made no sense in the light of an enlightened view of humanity. The biblical account of social order ran contrary to the more progressive views of the 19th century. Religious justification of slavery, the inferiority of women, and the biblical errancy were being dismantled. Yet here we are, nearly 200 years later, still fighting against theocratically based injustice. It is disheartening to think that the words of Elizabeth Cady Stanton still ring true. The greatest block today in the way of women's emancipation is the church, the canon law, the Bible, and the priesthood. Robert, as a physician who has turned writer, what are your thoughts about what is going on, about the defunding of Planned Parenthood, the repeal of the Affordable Housing Act, Health Care Act, the intrusion of the doctor-patient relationship? What goes on in your mind when you read about these things?
Well, I've been out of medicine for a while, but it's absolutely disgusting, and it really does destroy any relationship that a doctor could have with their patient. The whole premise is that the doctor is working in the best interest of that patient, and when you suddenly have to consider what some religious zealots are going to force that woman to do or you to do, you start introducing procedures that you would never imagine. The whole idea of doing, forcing a transvaginal ultrasound on a woman to convince her that she shouldn't get an abortion, that should not be Jerry Falwell's decision to make. That should be the woman's decision, and if she wants a physician's help, then he or she can help that woman with the decision. So, I think it's terrible. I think you raised lots of great points in there. I thought one of the interesting points that you made was about Richard Nixon, where he was taking the rational approach of that you need to support family planning. It doesn't really excuse that he vetoed legislation of $2 billion where states would provide adequate child health care, but at least it made coherent sense. He was saying, if we're not going to support financially, if we're not going to support people and their young children, we at least need to let them take control of their reproductive rights and make intelligent decisions. The way that the religious right operates nowadays is they're very eager to force you to have children. They want to get rid of all sorts of birth control. I'd like to talk about that a little bit. And it just doesn't make any sense what they're doing right now.
No, it certainly doesn't. It seems like the religious right definitely wants to be in the bedroom. And it doesn't just affect women. It affects women and men. Women, when not allowed to have control of their biology, it takes them out of the workforce, out of educational opportunities, and this affects every marriage. It should be up to the couple to decide when to start a family or if to start a family. And it seems like they want to have control of every aspect of our lives.
Right, and I think it's ironic that this is the party of the small government that, like you said, is right there in the bedroom with you and forcing these very intimate private decisions on every family. And it would probably be a very different environment if half of our legislators were women. And even when they're talking about women's reproductive rights, it's all dominated by men very specifically. You were telling me about where a woman was not allowed access to this, important legislative matters, and I think we somehow need to change that.
Yeah. Although there are plenty of women, though, who come out from the religious right who in fact agree with these sorts of things, which I find really astounding, that any woman would want to give up her rights, the rights over her body and the rights of her world and defining how she goes about her life.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of that probably comes from the very early indoctrination, I guess, of children, where if you took a teenage woman and said, do you want Jerry Falwell to decide how many kids you're going to have, when you're going to have them, do you want to figure that out with your husband, do you want to not have kids? A teenager would be appalled by that. If you take a 1-year-old and you start teaching them that you need to listen to God, you need to listen to your priest who is given the voice of God, and you teach them that very authoritarian point of view from before their minds are formed, well before they reach the age of reason, by the time they grow up, they're very prone to fall into these kind of terrible traps. And then, like you said, the whole family is affected by this. It's not just one person.
Yeah. Although we do spend quite a bit of money on abstinence-only programs, which I think you have a few comments about how well those seem to work.
Yes, I mean, obviously abstinence only didn't work well for the various maidens in Greek mythology that were raped by Zeus, for instance. It didn't work well for the Virgin Mary. And it doesn't work well, as we know, in real life. And the religious right takes great pains not to look at any of the research, not to look at any of the other countries where they've sort of taken a very rational approach to see what works and what doesn't. The religious right very pointedly doesn't want to look at a logical approach to this. There's an interesting study that looked at teenagers in Denmark and compared them to teenagers here in the United States. And they point out that 50 years ago, these two populations were relatively equal in terms of, I guess, their sexual mores. And Denmark took the approach that teenagers are regular people too, and we want to treat them with respect, and we want to let them, learn all of the facts and then make intelligent decisions. Unfortunately, the decisions that they might make from the religious right are wrong ones, because they learn about sex is not exactly equal to love. And in that context, it can be about mutual pleasure, it can be about forming a bond, and you want to take the appropriate precautions so you don't end up pregnant if you're not trying to have a family at that point. If you look at the pregnancy rates and the sexually transmitted disease rates and the abortion rates in these countries, the United States is 5 to 10 times higher than all these other industrialized nations. And I think most places around the world look at us as some kind of freak show, that we're here in the 21st century, we have all the science that lets us do all these amazing things, and we reject all of it. And we put into place these policies that assure us of having STDs and of having too many abortions and of having all these bad things that are very easily predictable.
So basically what you're saying is that the extremists, religious extremists, by preventing knowledge about birth control, about protective sex, about condom use, and so on, are actually aggravating the situation rather than preventing the exact problems that they're talking about.
Right, and they're preventing this in a very predictable way that they should know and that should be transparent to just about everybody. If you go back to Ronald Reagan, who's very much a conservative hero, he, as AIDS was starting to blossom onto the scene in the early 80s, he basically ignored it. And this is despite having been an actor with all these, a lot of friends who actually had AIDS. And this could only come from a religious background. There's no rational reason why a human being would sort of ignore this scourge that was taking over the country. And so to not make the connection to religion, I think, would be a big mistake. One of the things that Reagan instituted back then was what's come to be called the global gag rule, where you couldn't talk about, right? The United States would not provide all this funding that it does overseas. So it's not just our own citizens we're affecting, but I think right now there's roughly 30 million people have died of AIDS. There's about 2 or 3 million die each year from that. And we contribute to that a lot because we say, if you guys try to teach safe sex in your AIDS-ridden population, if you try to use condoms and try to teach people how you can get AIDS, we're not going to fund you anymore. So these countries are left with a horrible decision. Do they reject hundreds of millions of dollars of AIDS, financial aid, which they desperately need, and do that? And then either way, they kind of sacrifice their population. That gag rule got overturned when Clinton came to office, and then Bush too came in and reinstituted it.
Reinstituted it, yes. So in terms of personhood legislation, let's talk about that a little bit. This is where legislation is popping up in several states to include in many of the constitutions of the various states to make a zygote a person, to establish that is now a full human being and entitled to all the same rights as a 20-year-old human being. So what are your thoughts about that as a doctor?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely crazy. A zygote is a single cell, so you have an egg that gets fertilized by a sperm, and that's one cell. It's microscopic. You couldn't possibly see it. It doesn't have arms. It doesn't have legs. It doesn't have a heart. The only thing it could possibly have, if you're going to buy the argument of the religious right, is a soul. And I think we should talk about that later, because if you take out the soul, you're dealing with a single cell that hasn't differentiated at all. It's not a person. It's nothing like a person. At 9 weeks or so, you can see some mammalian traits taking form, and you can sort of make out a shape. And then as you go further in pregnancy, it starts to take the form and shape of a human. And I think there's a legitimate conversation to be had, not with the religious right dominating it and screaming out, everybody who tries to be sensible. Nobody's trying to promote everybody should go out and have an abortion. It's a great thing to do. But at the same point, we have to realize that you start as a single cell. You remain, then you divide into a few cells, and you go through this process, and then you have different layers of cells. In those early stages, there's nothing human about us. A teenage boy with an ejaculate of 200 million sperm could repopulate the entire world in a week, just like God did, if every one of those sperm is truly sacred, like in the Monty Python skit. And you've talked about how it's different for women and how eggs are a little harder to come by, and maybe you can talk about that and what pregnancy means for a woman and what it means for the men making legislation.
Well, for the evolutionary issues differ between men and women. Women have a much more costly reproductive system. They can only have so many offspring, where men, as you mentioned, can in fact reproduce quite readily if they're given the opportunity. Women are sort of the gatekeepers to that. We're the ones who tend to be the choosier of the two sexes and don't have easy access to sex. The issue with this, though, is because women have a much greater cost to bear. It's not just becoming pregnant, which, of course, can in and of itself be dangerous with STDs. The pregnancy can be dangerous. Women still die from pregnancy. And of course, then there's the issue of once the child is born, raising that child And it's always been that women have been the ones to take care of children over the years, and we're the ones that tend to sacrifice the most in caring for children. And that has nothing to do with saying that men don't love children as much as their wives do or the mothers do. But it's just a matter of pure biology, whose body is sacrificing more. And how this affects legislation, well, I'm not completely sure how it might affect the way the male legislatures think, except that I would say that what's really influencing them is what religion is teaching people, that women are indeed the temptresses. They're the ones who are causing men to fall from grace. And if it wasn't for women, if it wasn't for the evils of women, we'd still be in the Garden of Eden. And women have traditionally played an evil role in biblical teachings. Right,
biblical and mythological, which blends very nicely in with the biblical teaching. You have Pandora and her box were the same thing, and that Eve's true crime was that she tried to bring knowledge to the human race. So instead of giving her all the glory that should be attendant with that, she's become the downfall of mankind. I think it was interesting that the old right used to be very conservative, but they were more concerned with foreign policy. And the new right, largely in response to the feminist movement and to some gay rights that were won in the early 70s, there's a strong counter-reaction to that kind of material. And again, we talked a little bit about what Ronald Reagan, even though he's a conservative hero, has really done some things that were not in the interest of our society, certainly not in the interest of women, and the whole family, men as well. And then there were two articles that came out back then in those early 70s. One was The Politics of Housework, which really, where women were saying, look, we do all this stuff at home and you don't pay us for it. That doesn't mean it's not valuable to raise the children, do everything that you have to do to have a house. And that almost got some legislation, or that did get some help from a lot of men. The second article was about the myth of the vaginal orgasm. And I think that's worth talking about. That was an article that discussed the sexuality of women very openly. Back then, women were considered faulty and frigid and sent off to psychiatric institutes if they couldn't have an orgasm just from regular vaginal sex, preferably the missionary style as opposed. And this completely misunderstands the female anatomy. And something called female circumcision, which is basically genital mutilation. And by misunderstanding that the clitoris, which is the kind of seat of sexual pleasure for women, is really homologous to the penis, not to the prepuce, which is cut off in circumcision. So in these cultures that do genital mutilation, where they drag either baby girls or girls closer to to puberty, and where they drag them off and they lop everything off, and then euphemistically we say, well, this is just a cultural thing, and we need to accept it. Equating that to circumcision is saying lopping off the whole penis. It's not like getting a circumcision, getting the foreskin removed. And again, if there were more women in authority, I think, or more men that sort of made a point of this, I think this kind of practice would be less tolerated.
Well, let's hope so. I think, in fact, the issue of female sexuality is one that's been, for many, is a mystery. And in part because, unlike male orgasm, it isn't necessarily something visible. Mm-hmm. But it is interesting because in early Christian times in the United States, before we were, when we were still colonies, it was very, very common for women to be, it was expected that men had to give a woman an orgasm in order to conceive. And that myth still has been handed down, which is why we hear things about legitimate rape and so on, which gets tossed around. A woman who's been raped can't actually conceive. That mystery is because of, or that myth is been handed down through this way. There's certainly a lot of things that affect women that we could be talking about in today's program, but we are starting to running out of time, so we need to wrap it up. What are your closing thoughts on what we can do today?
Well, I guess one thing that we didn't really get to talk about that I was hoping we would are how the religious right insists on equating homosexuality with bestiality and the cause of AIDS, or with pedophilia. and saying, we shouldn't have gay people in the Boy Scouts, we shouldn't have gay people in the church because they'll have access, but it really has nothing to do with being homosexual if you're a pedophile. They don't have any higher rates. And so the Catholic Church, kind of aided and abetted all the way up the hierarchy to the Pope, has perpetrated this for decades and continues to do so, and hasn't really quite come out by releasing all the evidence that it's sitting on. So one thing that I'd really like to see us do on a practical level is to try to put a lot of pressure on the Vatican and see if they release all these records so we can investigate the thousands upon thousands of child rapes and get some real things done about that to help those people.
It would be nice to finally find out how much the church actually knew and how much they were sitting on. Well, in terms of, I think for us, for women, that it's time for us to get angry. I'm pretty angry. It upsets me that I see my niece, who's only 7, have her rights taken away when I was her age, it seemed like the doors were just starting to open for women, and now they're simply closing. So if you have questions about this issue, please come visit us on our Facebook account. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear some of your questions and ideas for the show. We're on our 9th program, and we're starting to take in more and more information and ideas from the audience there. So, and I hope that you can join us again. So,
I'd also like to echo something you said earlier about this isn't just a women's issue. If you're a man with a wife, a girlfriend, a daughter, a mother, which most of us had, this is your issue too. And you want everybody to be treated more appropriately, and you want all of your female relationships to have a better future than the one that the religious right is trying to paint them into.
Let's hope so. So please continue your support. We welcome it. And please join us again next week on The Road to Reason. And we'll be seeing, I believe Rick Wingrove will be with us next week.
Yep.
And we'll see what we come up with to talk about then. So thank you for joining us, and see you.